As so as I explained to Chris, this has been a monthly web-based seminar series in history of political thought that Jeff was really the initial instigator on. This is our second year now. Began in the pandemic, but we decided that the format worked nicely, and so a group of several of us kind of take turns running it. So it's my turn this time. So on behalf of UC Davis and the other people, welcome to Chris Laursen. Chris is actually joining us from Spain. It's almost dinner time there for him, so he has incentive here. And so Chris has spent almost his entire career at UC Riverside, a little bit at Wake Forest, if I recall correctly, before that, and is well-known and well-published and well-cited scholar of the history of political thought. And he really is a history of political thought guy, maybe even more so than most of us in the room. His work has spanned a whole range of time periods and languages and topics, but a lot of it beginning medieval and early modern concerns with religion. And so the Constant is kind of a continuation of that strand of Chris's research. And so today he is presenting this article on Constant's views on religion, which I was entirely ignorant of. So I learned a lot from reading the paper. And so welcome to Chris. And I've told Chris to give us kind of a 5-10 minute summary of the sort of motivations and main points of the paper, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to this discussion. Look forward to learning more about each of you for future reference. The background that I think I owe this paper to is that I was trained as a political theorist and historian of political thought. And I do remember, even as a graduate student, so now this is 35 years ago or more, asking my professor, who was also a historian of political thought, John Pocock, why we didn't study theology, because isn't all political theory related to theology? And he said, yes, it is, but we have contemporary specialties, and some people do history, and other people do politics, and other people do sociology, and other people do religion. And that, yes, of course, they're all related, but nobody can do all of that. He did, by the way, do quite a bit of study of theology, especially when he wrote about Gibbon, because it turned out that Gibbon knew a lot about theology, and to really understand his history, he had to look at some of that. And I have improvised some theology or study of religion as an outsider, really, in some of my previous work, because after all, you have to admit that politics is almost always related to religion. And it is a peculiarity that the training for political theorists usually does not include much. We note this oddity that Thomas Hobbes devotes a whole book of his Leviathan to theology. And we just think, oh, well, that's just a weirdness that's Hobbes. We don't know that much, at least most of us. Obviously, I'm sure all of you are exceptions and do know a lot about religion. But at least in my day, we were not trained to learn anything about that. So it's been a continual interest for me. John mentioned I've worked in the area, especially in the area of religious toleration. But of course, usually I was talking about the political theory of religious toleration, not that much about the theology of it. And I would try to improvise a little that Calvin said this or Luther said that, but I never read all of Calvin or all of Luther or anything like that. So I've always considered it a weakness in my both training and much of my practice is to not know enough about religion. A second autobiographical reason for doing this was about 20 years ago when it came out. Etienne Hoffmann gave me his modern edition of Constance de la Religion. at 977 pages, and with no particular reason to read it, it stood on my shelves a pretty long time before I decided I'm going to try to do something with this. And it's a commitment. It takes time to get through it. It's well written and it's not technical, so it's not that hard to read. But what I discovered and hadn't really known, even if I had taught and read about other aspects of Constant, that this was 40 years of his life, that this was always in the background for him. So it was very interesting for me to discover that. And then finally, I was always interested in Constant, partly because he's famously one of the founding philosophers of liberalism. And of course, I had read and studied lots of John Locke and John Stuart Mill, and was exploring some of the French and German liberals, and came across him and discovered he was a good thinker, very influential in his time and for at least half a century afterward. Worth understanding Constant, worth understanding liberalism. And then, of course, the stereotype that in general, many liberals don't care about religion, don't think it's important, would rather be secular, modern, and so forth. Now, of course, that's obviously not true in the case of John Locke. But also, most of us political theorists don't read all of his theological works. They're too long, too boring to us. And yet they might be fundamental even to his way of thinking. Many of us political theorists don't know, because we're never going to read all that stuff that he wrote. But anyway, I had the opportunity to read this book because I was invited to write a chapter for a book to be published in Spanish on progress. So I started reading through Constant's Religion. I wanted to kill several birds with one stone here, and discovered his focus on progress all the time. Progress and perfectibility pretty much runs the two together, very often in the same sentence. And then when he's talking about perfectibility, it pretty much looks like he's talking about progress and the other way around. So this seemed like a good text to read for picking out what it said about progress and perfectibility. So that pretty much explains this paper. When I've talked to other people about it, they've also said, oh, I didn't know he wrote that either. And a few others have said, yeah, I saw that brick of 977 pages in the French version. And nobody in English knew about it until the English version came out 15 years ago or so, also co-edited by Etienne Hoffmann. And it's rightly gotten more attention, but of course, most political theorists would still rather read the more political works than the religion. So I hope by summarizing some of the angles of Constant on religion, I will help any sort of philosopher and political theorist to know that Constant said something about religion, and now know something about what he said about it and how important it was to him. And that'll save you reading 977 pages.
Okay, thanks, Chris. How do you want to handle Q&A? How do we do this, Jeff? Do we do the show hand thing, and do I call on people? I think that's what we do.
Yes.
All right, so put your hands up if you have a question or comment. The virtual hand, Aline, but go ahead.
I'm trying. I cannot figure out how to do the virtual one. Anyway, so thanks for the paper.
And you might quickly introduce yourself, since Chris might not know.
Yeah, my name is Alin Murescu. It's a Romanian name, don't bother with it. And I'm an associate professor at the U of H in political theory.
I think I know you through Aurelian Kranzu.
Yeah, he was my advisor at IUB, yes. So I have like a big question that's related with a smaller one. The big question is, what exactly is the point of the article? It's, to me, it was more like a long book review, which might be helpful, but it's pretty much, is there another point, like it's relevant today exactly for what? You have a few lines at the end, but compared with the whole summary of all the volumes, it kind of like feels, and I was thinking, like, for example, if you would shorten the summary and eventually, I don't know, put constant in some sort of a dialogue with previous authors that did some sort of similar job. I'm thinking now about like Spinoza or Giambattista Vico. They also think about how religion evolved throughout times. And well, Spinoza is more focused on the Jews and the Old Testament, but for Vico, for example, he tries to go through the three periods of religion and whatnot, and counterpoise the pagan religions with the revealed religion and so on and so forth. And he also has kind of like a more or less anthropological approach, if you want. And speaking of progress, now this is a silly question, but I think it's still funny. Otherwise, I won't ask. I was thinking that if you go with constant ideas of progress, why is he talking? He's bad mouthing Islam, which comes after Christianity. Because if you go with this idea of the progress of ideas, probably not only Islam but the Baha'i would be like the greatest development. So obviously now we are speculating, but I was wondering what's your opinion about what Constant would have thought about this Baha'i, maybe New Age type of approach in religion.
Well, let me start with just that last one and then get back to the others. I don't remember him mentioning Baha'i. He also doesn't mention Islam much. He puts it down when he mentions it, says it's a frozen religion that isn't changing much, and that's a bad thing about it because he wants any religion to be changing and moving toward progress. I suspect he didn't know a hell of a lot about Islam and possibly nothing at all about Baha'i. Remember, the focus of the book is pre-Christian religions. He does then refer to later issues or matters occasionally, but not that often. So basically, my answer would be Islam is not really on the radar for him, except for he's absorbed some information that it's not a religion that changes much, and that's bad for him. And back to your original and the point of the article, and that is an interesting one because as I read the book, I was thinking, what am I going to say here? And I'd have to say there is no great overarching new theoretical take. So this is a summary review of what Constant said and where he fits in the history of ideas about progress and perfectibility at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. It certainly could be compared to Spinoza or Vico. Vico is maybe a little closer to Constant in the sense of doing a lot more research. Spinoza limited his research in the history of religion to the Jews and the Christians, and to the best of my knowledge anyway. Constant could be called anthropological because he says this is part of human nature and it's something we can't get rid of and shouldn't and so forth. He's a rather different sort of thinker, and I think everyone will agree to that, than Vico. Vico is kind of an odd man out in the 18th century. So Constant is a late 18th century Enlightenment historian of religion, to make his point over and over that priestly religions are bad, but a religious sense or feeling is necessary. And of course, it could be put in contrast with other thinkers. In fact, our own John Scott has a paper that I've read on Rousseau on perfectibility. And he shows how three other people picked that up. Mary Wollstonecraft, Godwin, and was it Condorcet pick up Rousseau on perfectibility. And you learn about Rousseau and how his ideas about perfectibility came down through three other figures. Well, we can add to that Constant, because I do mention Rousseau and some of the other intermediary figures that he was getting his idea from. So this is the kind of article that is a review and summary. And again, you should appreciate because it saves you 977 pages.
I did. I appreciate that part.
But I'm not saying that Constant did any major breakthrough on religious studies. I do think, and he drew on these German Protestant historians of religion, read them carefully, and gave us a much simplified version. He didn't do comparative the religion the way it was done later in the 19th century and in the 20th century. He did this kind of amateur comparative religion, I guess you could call it. One set of his main sources is what we call literature. Homer and other Greek and Roman writers, even a belles lettres. So he's not even interpreting a lot of original religious texts. Doesn't interpret the Bible, doesn't interpret a Jewish text. It's a more literary, historical, comparative study of religion.
I totally agree with you. And if I can take one more minute, I was thinking that it would be interesting, in my opinion, to basically compare and contrast maybe with Vico, because in terms of like where they put the emphasis, so if Vico puts the emphasis like the Greeks were not as evolved and the Homer and whatnot, etc., etc., and basically the true evolvement the true progress comes with the Jews and eventually with Christianity. For Constant, it appears to be exactly the opposite, and it will be interesting to see why. And since I'm a Romanian, I would like to brag a little bit about the fact that the most famous historian of religious ideas is a Romanian originally, Ilaidi, who taught at Chicago school. And I think the department is named after him. I'm not sure. The history of religion department.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've read some of him too a long time ago. I have to say.
Okay. Yeah, he also wrote 3 volumes. I mean, they are more than, I think, over 1,500 pages, going through all basically the religions from the oldest one up until today. Today being 1980s.
Comparing and contrasting Vico with Constant with Eliade would be very interesting. Partly for that on methods, because after all, Vico also uses a lot of belles lettres sources, not just sort of narrower religious history sources.
Right, like I was thinking about Homer and whatnot, yes. But okay, I'll stop here.
Jeff was up next. And by the way, Chris, you only saved us about 950 pages. Jeff.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. This was, I found this very interesting. I guess maybe first question has to do with maybe if you could clarify a little bit more and expand what you take to be Constant's understanding of what progress is exactly. I mean, I got the sense that it was a kind of cognitive progress, in part because it's connected with, as you say, close to the end, or drive to know or drive to examine. But I also wondered if there was a kind of moral progress that was implicit in his understanding as well. And I guess this is connected with, like progress with regard exactly to what in religion, because you can think about progress in religion in a couple different ways, right? You can think about the progress of religious institutions, which I take it, was somewhat of the focus here, right? With the idea of priests, I mean, this whole way of having priests and this hierarchy, this is total nonsense and we need to get beyond that and progress beyond that. But there also might be a way of thinking about the theological dogma itself, that there can be a kind of progress in the understanding of, before we used to think about spirits and now we think about a more sort of abstract deity. So is it that too? I mean, I have a second question, but I'll just stop there. Maybe you can clarify.
Yeah, better one at a time, so I can answer them one at a time and not have forgotten the previous one. It's not so much cognitive. He makes it clear that the most important progress that's made is moral and secondarily political or social life. And he gives us the elements, liberty and equality. So he is a liberal in the larger sense of what a liberal is. He says progress should come in terms of liberty, that is, of each individual to do their own thinking and so forth, and equality. It's an egalitarian in religion and politics. So, and he makes it very clear that he's not that interested, although it's an element, in the science and other cognitive knowledge. The most important level for progress is morality.
I see. So for him, sort of, the Protestantization of Christian religion wouldn't be progress for him necessarily, right? That it's you're getting like an increasingly rationalized or abstract form of theology. Like that wouldn't be necessarily progress.
Not necessarily for the rationality, but yes, for the liberty and equality. Because he makes that point in religion and in politics and in morality. That's the fundamental basis of progress and perfectibility. So Protestantism to him isn't a better doctrine than Catholicism. It's more independence and equality for individuals and less priestcraft.
Yeah, good. And okay, so maybe you could, I mean, I guess my second question has to do sort of with the account of exactly how this progress happens. Is it something about the sort of a kind of implicit drive for freedom that human beings have, that's, we like to cast off our chains, or, what exactly is the mechanism that Constant has in mind that sort of generates? I have this in part because I was thinking of Rousseau and the perfectibility point that was just raised a couple minutes ago, because of course Rousseau's view of perfectibility, it doesn't seem to envision, it seems like Constant, a sort of steady perfection, right? This is, you could go up, but you can very much go down at the same time. So what is what mechanism gives him more optimism than Rousseau?
One, he thinks it's a drive of human nature, that equality and independence or liberty are human drives. So that's a fundamental to his anthropology. But also he makes these points about agonism, fights, disagreement, contention, lead toward more liberty and equality. So he actually thinks that the more we argue and bicker, the closer we'll get to liberty and equality. And it is a process over time. It's not instant, and it's like fought out in history, and he uses words very close to that at some point.
Good. Yeah, thanks.
Shalini.
Thanks. I really enjoyed reading the paper. My main question is whether you could say a little bit more about the connection between morality and religion. I thought it was super interesting, this idea that religion doesn't start with any connection to morality, but morality is introduced to it over time, and that there being a way that religion and morality can work together because they're both sentiments. So I had sort of two more specific questions related to what I just said, which is, how exactly does Constant understand morality? And I guess one thing I was surprised to see that it's religion's reign on self-interest that is most important. I almost would have thought that would come from morality. And so does that make sense? And so then I was also just interested in how this religion's want to connect to invisible powers relates to its a capacity to rein in self-interest, if it does at all, if there was any treatment of that. Those are my questions. Thank you.
On both of them, I'm going to repeat this point that he doesn't define what morality is, but he makes it clear it's connected with liberty and equality. And how does it happen? How does religion? He gives us a couple of narratives of how particular religions move in that direction, partly in discovering new things, because he says we're always changing our social foundations, our bases for living. And along with that, and in the agonism of religious life, where there is religious freedom, we will move toward equality and freedom. I did quote 2 or 3 people that said they didn't see how that could happen, and it was not very believable. And he doesn't give us a great deal of technical discussion about how it's more an assertion of a liberal faith that this will happen and that he can find it. Good point is that he finds in history what he wants to find, which is this development of freedom and equality wherever the priests are not in control or have been gotten rid of. But the morality is key to him. And I think I can see what he means when he says religion makes morality better, at the same time that we tend to think it's morality that would make religion better. But if religion is this search for, and at different points he describes it as the mysterious and the unknown, but also he also describes religion as equality and liberty. And there's mutually reinforcing, I guess is the best way I could interpret what he says. But a point that if we tend to, as modern philosophers, think that it's some sort of pure morality that somebody like Kant gave us, then we can replace religion. And Kant is saying, no, you'll still need religion. No, he doesn't tell us why we need it after Kant. He's not like a technical philosopher telling us that, even though Kant told you can get religion within the limits of pure reason. Constant is just always saying, you need more, that isn't enough.
But just to clarify, but the connection between what religion is, in terms of this connection to what is unseen, or the mysterious, and the connection between religion in that sense and its ability to curb self-interest in Constant, what is that connection? I don't know if he draws it out. I was just curious.
Yeah, but other than inserting it, I'm not sure I could tell you where he shows a technical way. This is how it does it. You do get, and he does say this about the religion, that what you can see through religion are things like beauty and grandeur. And perhaps that can help you say, my personal self-interest isn't everything because there's beauty in the world. And there are these other religious concepts of liberty and equality in the world, and something mysterious that I don't know. So maybe just doing what is best for me and self-interest right now without knowing everything isn't capturing everything. So I need to keep my mind open to something further. But it's not a modern analytic philosophy direct deduction of this. Here's one that, after having promised you I'd save you 977 pages, you should read the whole thing with your question in mind. And maybe you will catch something that I didn't, that there's more of a mechanism that you can see there for how religion reigns in self-interest, which is an important question for him.
Thank you.
Hey, Michael Hawley, I'm sorry, I don't know you. If you would introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Mike Hawley. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Duke University, but I'm coming to.
Oh, right. Yeah, right. I know of you. So congratulations.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes. My reputation has preceded me or something.
You're coming to where?
No, I'm headed to the University of Houston with Aline and Jeff. So my question is, do you see a tension or a problem in what seems to, and maybe this is the wrong way of reading it, but this sounds like a fairly irreligious defense of religion. In other words, you place Constant on the side of the Enlightenment that's trying to persuade, he's on the side saying, well, we can't do without religion. But it doesn't seem like these are the sort of arguments that any authentically religious person would accept as reasons for defending religion. In other words, no religious person presumably thinks that their way of worshiping God and what they think that God wants is going to get improved upon in the future. Or if it is, it's going to get improved upon only because God reveals further stuff that they previously didn't know. Is it, so in other words, is Constant's audience really just fellow, is he himself irreligious in the fundamental sense of not really believing in this and sharing with his fellow irreligious Enlightenment figures, trying to persuade them that they should appreciate the practical effects of this? In other words, is this a book that he wouldn't want read by people who he would want to keep religious? Yeah, does this make sense as a question?
He does at least mention the point that irreligion among religious leaders doesn't affect the faithful. But I think he's making that point as a sort of selfish power-related argument for the priests, that they can be atheists, and as long as that doesn't leak out, then it won't affect the faithful. But interesting, you say a religious person wouldn't like this. I've discussed this with a number of people over the last year or two, and a self-described religious person told me, this is about improving religion in the future. And he's an Episcopalian, meaning English Catholic in so many words. And he does think, this person, that his contemporary Episcopalianism is much more progressive and advanced than 100 years ago Episcopalianism, and certainly more than Catholicism. And I've heard this from other people I've heard this from Catholics who say, well, we represent the liberal wing of Catholicism, which is just like this. We don't really believe all the folk tales of Catholicism, and we don't spend all our time worshiping Mary, but still we can see something in Mary that's universal, and that it's humane and is mysterious, and that we still don't know enough about. But the way we read Mary and anything else in an institutionalized religion is in the direction of liberty and equality and so forth. So in other words, I think Constant could have thought this is for religious people, not for the most traditionalist, hidebound, backwards religious people, but for what we even call today progressive religious people. The question of how religious he was came up, and I think I had a sentence or two about it. Probably not religious in a traditional sense, but he does over and over say that Protestantism is better than Catholicism. And that may not be just for the sake of his audience. That may be that he really thinks it is. And he thinks, but clearly he thinks everything we do and have now is a stepping stone to the future, and it's going to change. So the point is, he would have a religion that can change and can expect to change. And does that make you unreligious? By the standard that religion is a tradition that you accept as true for all times and all places, and it won't change much, then he's not religious. But if religion is something that connects with the mysterious and the unknown and values like liberty and equality, and is not just self-interested, rational self-interest, self-interest better understood, it's not that, it's something more and different, then he's religious. And like I said, I was kind of interested to see that at least one of my friends, a modern religious person, self-described, so you may say he's not, said that this is what he thought. We're in a process. So my religion today is not what it'll be 10 years from now, and it's better than it was 10 years ago.
Ana Marisa?
Yes, thank you. I had a question about sort of why is religion essential sort of for the promotion of moral progress, right? So the main takeaway claim, the way you present Constance's argument, is that religion provides this counter-enlightenment force in society that provides a set of values and morality, right? And so there is a number of these types of projects around this time. And like you mentioned, how he was really familiar with all the romantic thinkers in Germany, right? And so there were a number of projects of the sort trying to provide a set of values or a way of thinking about the world as a counterweight to this enlightenment conviction in reason, right? So Schiller's letters on aesthetic education, for example. I was just thinking of that because you mentioned Schiller in here too. So I was wondering, what is it about religion per se that makes it so essential to human progress for Constant? And I'm asking this in particular with regard to the definition that he provides of religion himself, which you quote, where he says there's two components to religion, right? One is the sentiment and the other is the form. The form is what changes. The sentiment is really what makes religion so essential to human nature. And that really is the desire for communication with the invisible powers, right? So then I guess the question is, how is the morality connected to this point about communication with the invisible powers? If that's what essentially religion is for Constant, then that's what would make the connection of it being religion over any other kind of moral force. That's how far I've gotten with this question, but I wonder what Constant was saying.
I think it's a good one, because you're saying, if you've got this sentiment of religion, what does that have to do with morality?
Yeah.
He seems to think they're closely related. He doesn't spell out exactly how.
Oh. That's why it's not in the paper, because he doesn't specify it.
Yeah. If he had, I would have. Again, he's not a technical philosopher, so he doesn't know to, make distinctions that strongly, and he'll run things together. He even likes contradictions. Remember, he says, I also quoted that he says, we use contradictions to make this progress, and no religion or society will not have internal contradictions. They'll all have them. But that's the agonistic side that will make them make progress. He really has no warrant, because maybe another way you're saying, of putting what you're saying is, how do we know that our sentiments and our agonism and our discussions and debates will lead to liberty and equality? And he doesn't really do anything except assert that and find evidence in history that it has happened. But of course, he can't claim it's always happened that way, and there haven't been major steps backward and so forth.
So he doesn't then really argue the point that the idea of moral progress is related to what he says religion really is, our intrinsically experienced need to communicate with the invisible powers.
Yeah, I would say he asserts that they coexist. They're both there and they're part of the process, but he doesn't connect them by saying one causes the other or they're caused.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, keep going.
Then on what grounds is he able to assert that it is religion per se that is essential to progress and not any other means of providing a counterweight to enlightenment?
Yeah, but let me go back to what you said about counter-enlightenment. That doesn't sound quite right to me, because most of what I know about the counter-enlightenment as a studied tradition is return to earlier forms of religion and so forth. And he wants to go beyond the earlier ones into something new. He is counter the totally rationalistic atheist enlightenment, because he said,
yeah, that's more how I was thinking of it, just not necessarily sort of rolling back enlightenment, but there is all these ideas that enlightenment is unstoppable, but how are we going to ensure that sort of humanity doesn't destroy itself by this overwhelming trust in enlightenment, right?
Yeah. No particular close etiology of that I know of. There was a book not too long ago, maybe 10 years ago, on the Enlightenment's view of sentiments. And I can't remember the title. It might have been even something like Sentimental Enlightenment or something like that.
The Enlightenment of Sentiment by Michael Fraser.
Okay, that was probably it. who's trying to bring back
Or
in
letting
this, sentiment thing. I don't believe he knew anything about Constant on religion. He's probably covering a mostly somewhat earlier period when he's talking about sentiments in the mid and later 18th century. But no strict mechanism is given. This is all, what's the word? I don't want to say run together because that sounds like it's slapdash, but this is all just associated. In other words, this sentiment that includes invisible powers and mystery and liberty and equality, we have this feeling, will drive us in the direction of a more perfected religion and morality. And you are right to ask how. And I'm afraid he'd say, well, look, it did in this case, as you know, this religion got polished and better. And you say, well, but exactly how? And that's not the level at which he tries to argue.
All right. Thank you.
Michael.
Yeah, Chris, this is a very interesting argument, and maybe it's because I'm teaching Hegel now that I who is a close contemporary and who voices many of the similar concerns and ideas. Hegel wants to argue too that Protestantism is the way of the future, and it is a very de-theologized Protestantism, right? That for intellectuals who are able to attend Hegel's lectures, it becomes absolute knowledge, if they're smart enough and actually understand German, as opposed to the Polish counts who didn't have the faintest idea what he was talking about. But he does have an explanation for why Protestantism is the wave of the future, and it has to do with the development, and by that he means not, he's pretty clear that it's not supralapsarian Calvinism that he's talking about, that it's not predestinarian, there are a whole variety of things that it's not. Because those, in a way, are almost as bad as traditional, Catholicism from Hegel's point of view. So it means something like a continuation in the progress of religion towards a kind of secular morality. And I'm wondering, it seems to me Constant is saying a lot of the same things. And I would just point out, when it comes to the Episcopalian Church, your friend who he's talking to is part of the church that split away from the African Episcopalians and others who still are not willing to let women serve in priest positions, et cetera, et cetera. But what I want to ask you about is what follows from that, because my view is that while Hegel and Constant are right about this leading to increasing liberalization, it also leads people to begin to feel that this isn't religion anymore, right? Kierkegaard's response to the sort of Hegelian church that grew up in Denmark, Nietzsche's response to this, and even on the other hand, the sort of fundamentalist reaction in America in the early 20th century, it's all a turn away from an intellectualized religion which doesn't seem to have heart anymore. It doesn't speak to people's feelings, and so I'm wondering whether this is something that Constant saw or thought about, or was he so near the beginning of this that he couldn't see what the consequences of this would be?
There's plenty to remark on there. Let me start with one. The whole point about Hegel, yes, they overlap. Constant doesn't start publishing these books until the 1820s. And I did ask a Constant specialist if she knew whether or not Hegel had read Constant or Constant had read Hegel. And the answer was she didn't know. But it was certainly possible because they did overlap for those years. And they both, of course, would have been against Calvinism and more traditional Protestantism as much as they were against Catholicism. But whether this is moving into no religion at all or not, And given my Episcopalian friend, oh, they want to claim they really are religious. This just isn't the religion of traditional dogmas and the fear of an angry God and all the other not so rational elements of the more tradition-oriented parts of religion. So maybe you could say that these people just represent the modern religious liberals today. And of course, the conservatives are going to say that they're not really religious. That's you have to have the fear of God if you're going to be really religious. You have to love God. Whereas he's saying you have to be impressed by the mystery of God. You have to think it's beautiful. Other such things that what we're calling really religious people would say that's superficial. He would say, no, that's religion. We're still making our connection with the mysterious and the unknown. And we're still recognizing other important things in the world besides our own self-interest.
Mhm. No, I certainly, I mean, I agree with you, and I agree with Constant to this sense that these people do think that they're religious, and they are religious in a particular way, and that we probably should be talking not about Christianity, but about Christianities in the plural. But I do think it is surprising how unsatisfying that Protestantism is to people. And if you look at the decline of the Protestant consensus in the US and the decline in mainline Protestant churches and the growth in evangelical churches, it just speaks to the fact that that the people that consider themselves nuns now, with a NONES, really are they still are religious because they believe in things like human rights and equality and dignity and a lot of things that are very hard to justify on a scientific foundation. But they don't like the trappings of traditional religion, and they don't like the spirituality of the African American church, for example, or the ecstatic experience of religion that you get in Pentecostalism. So it is. So I just wonder if he suspected that was one of the likely consequences, that the ever greater rationalization would lead to a return back to something more primitive.
I would say not. He does talk about sliding back, but 3 steps forward, 2 back. So it's never a 3 steps forward, 4 back. And he over and over, he talks about inevitable progress. So I think he really believes this is going to change. Here I have a partial answer for you in contemporary cases. My one Catholic and one Episcopalian person are intellectuals after all. And they think they're religious and they're very satisfied. They're not the ones who have left the churches because they're not satisfied. They're people who've stayed in the church. I even know another one who's a Marxist and an Episcopalian. And he's happy.
I know these people certainly exist. I know these people certainly exist, and I admire them, and I agree with them about a lot of things. I'm just astonished that people don't, that there's so many people that don't find that kind of intellectualized religion compelling. And I wonder whether or not it will ever be compelling for lots of people.
I'm guessing not too, because maybe it is something that intellectuals can do, because we can read all the history of 15 religions and think that's interesting, and it doesn't really affect us that deeply. Other political emotions, like intellectuals often aren't quite as patriotic and nationalistic as people who, really live off their patriotism and their nationalism and so forth. But we intellectuals will keep writing about how you should have a liberal nationalism, not an extreme and fanatic one. And you should have a liberal patriotism and not an extremist and fanatic one. Whether the real world will ever do that, or they will go right ahead and continue having their fanaticisms, only time will tell. But again, Constant believes in progress and that more and more people will be converted to, if you want to call it, milquetoast religion, to it's not unemotional because it is a sentiment to him, but not, and it's possibly even a deep emotion of respect for the unknown and of mystery, but it's not a wild and fanatic emotion. Maybe we could put it something like that.
It is, when Luther originally wrote Mighty Fortress is Our God, he wrote it to a syncopated rhythm, right? So it was much more like a popular song today, and it was meant to be enthused people. And of course, gradually the church slowed it down and it became something well known, but not particularly moving anymore. So it's
the Enlightenment had something to do with that. There are some great quotes about people saying, I hope you're unenthusiastic.
yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
Because enthusiastic meant you were a terrible fanatic. And if you would be someone, I would like to marry you because I'm unenthusiastic about you. How's that line going to go off? But their point was I'm rationally sentimental about it, in a controlled sense. And in that way, it's more reliable, and that's way it's closer to a more civil society. But I'm unenthusiastic.
I'd like to ask a question, and I'm gonna play to type and ask a question about Rousseau. And that is, there's so much overlap in between Rousseau and Constant on the question of religion, and yet a huge difference, right? So I'm trying to pinpoint difference, and I have a feeling it has to do with what you mentioned about the paper I sent you about perfectibility. And so let me start just quickly. What do they have in common? Well, they have in common that at least that there's a sort of natural tendency towards religiosity in human beings that can be turned to fanaticism, the priestcraft, all that kind of stuff. They both agree that the sort of atheistic enlightenment, rationalistic enlightenment is insufficient or even dangerous. They both agree that religion somehow is connected with morality. People have need or certain beliefs that are tied up with morality. They both agree that Protestantism is superior to Catholicism and others in the freedom and equality and the lack of mediation and dependence upon others institutionally or personally. They both agree in a kind of that Protestantism equals something like the morality of the gospel. It's almost not quite a rational religion, but consistent with that. They both seem to think that we need religion politically, socially, morally, maybe in somewhat different ways. So there's a lot of overlap. But it seems to me that for Rousseau, he's in the business of promoting religion, religiosity as a break, right? So it's a break on the wicked because they are fear, for example, for the afterlife or something like that. It provides consolation and hope for those of us who are powerless and so on and so forth. So in other words, it's kind of a religion is a salve in a world that is unjust and unequal and probably not going to get much better, right? I'm just sketching there, Rousseau. Whereas for Constant, rather than it being a break or a salve of some sort, it seems to be part and parcel of progress and perfectibility, as you say. So I'm wondering whether the differences, I mean, there might be differences between them as well, but the key difference between them, given all these similarities, isn't their assessment of progress or perfectibility.
Is something else. You mean?
No, whether it is, I triple negative to you in the sentence. So yeah, whether that isn't, whether it seems to me it might be the case that the fundamental difference between them on religion and its role for individuals in society is their assessment of perfectibility and progress. Rousseau doesn't think we're going to progress and therefore we need it as a check, a salve, et cetera. Whereas Constant believes that we're making progress, and somehow religion is part and parcel of that.
Yes. The short
Okay,
answer is
good.
yes.
Aline has a no.
But those that distinction seems to me very important, and Constant has this high modern liberal view of, yes, we're always making progress, or with small steps back, and we will continue to, and perfectibility is virtually endless. He doesn't think we'll ever get to a place where we should stop, because there'll always be some changes of circumstances or ideas or society that we should just keep progressing forever. Like, it's a vision of life in motion, always on the march. Don't ever, plan on believing everything in religion and morality at any point in time, because there will always be reason for new reforms and progress. And as you know, Rousseau sometimes gets kind of backward looking. I'd like to go back to the ancient city states and live in that kind of polity and morality. And that's not constant. It's always, no, we should always be moving forward. Someone once wrote a book on Montaigne called Montaigne en mouvement. Well, Constant could be Constant on believing that the world is always en mouvement. We're always moving forward. In some ways, that's very much, at least a stereotype of modern liberalism. That, we really believe that, in the larger sense, not in the narrow sense, we really believe that things are getting better. Every once in a while, we elect a president that makes it not so obvious, or a war breaks out that makes it not so obvious, but we still think it's all getting better, and there will be better, what's the word, repercussions or better consequences, even from the things that we think are bad right now. There will be continued progress, and Constant, I think, is a total believer in that.
Thanks. We have a few more minutes. And Aline has another question.
Thanks again. By the way, speaking of everything is in movement and whatnot, I was thinking about the name of Macron's party, which will have elections in a few days, La République en Marche. We are always moving forward. And to answer John's, kind of like he saw me like shaking my head and whatnot in disapproval, I'm not sure that for Rousseau, he's backward looking on progress or whatnot. First of all, he talks about the progress on the unstoppable progress of inequality, which is a different type of progress, but it's a progress that's unstoppable. And he tries to stop it and to turn it backwards with his own social contract. To what extent he succeeds or not, that's another story. But I don't see, in terms of progress, as John does, Rousseau and Constant as opposed. They are both part of the same movement, La République en Marche, if you want. Avant la lettre, to speak French.
But it is very different. I mean, you make the point. Constant would be insisting our progress is always toward more equality. And of course, that may change as context change, and therefore equality may mean something different over time. But it'll still be toward equality. And Rousseau worries about the wrong sort of progress. That's the progress toward inequality. Constant is almost a Pollyanna compared to Rousseau.
I agree, but I think that both of them share at least this vision that progress one way or another, it really doesn't matter. It's basically unstoppable. We are always on march, if you want. Yeah. And my general point that I was trying to make before was like listening to all these great interventions. I was thinking that it seems to me quite apparent that obvious actually that you should go into the comparing and contrasting part with Constant, with this paper, because otherwise it will basically fade away unnoticed. While you have so many possibilities here, from Rousseau to Hegel to whatnot. And I was thinking about what Anna Marisa was saying about the relationship between morality and religion. Tocqueville comes later, right? But not too much later. But for Tocqueville, the relation, here you have another French guy, kind of late Enlightenment, who basically says that's the problem with the French. They don't see the connection between religion and democracy, and the friends of religion are the enemies of democracy, and the friends of democracy are the enemies of religion. While I, Tocqueville, believe, now I'm quoting from the top of my head, but I think I'm pretty accurate. I believe that who he does not believe should serve, and he who wants to be free should believe. Speaking of what's the relationship between the morality and religion, and he has at least two interventions that I know of, again, from the top of my head. One is in the preface, and the other one is in the second volume. I can't remember the chapter from the top of my head, but it's the chapter on religion, where basically he makes this argument that you cannot really have a morality absent in a democracy, absent some religious belief that will function as some sort of an internal break against. And by the way, he also has some remarks about Islam, but I won't go there. But I was just trying to say that I think that you are onto something that it's way more, can be way more explored and exploited, if I may say so, than just the summary of Constant, as fascinating as it is.
You are right. I think that a comparison with Tocqueville would also be very interesting because of the importance that Tocqueville gave to religion in America and the peculiar religion he found in America, so different from what he claimed existed in France. So it is an important part of his theory and worth a comparison. I was kind of hoping I put Constant out there, and then some Tocqueville scholar reads it and sees it and makes the comparison, but maybe I'll have to do it myself. That has happened before.
If I have time, I'll do it.
Please do. I will be your first reader and very interested to hear how that comes out. And of course, but even people who study Tocqueville, at least some of them, do make a point that somewhat unusually Tocqueville gave so much credit to American religion. Other people were not giving as much.
Jeff?
Yeah, sorry, Britt. Just quickly, I think following up on this point, I was curious about, maybe this is in part returning to Mike Hawley's question as well, about the motivation, Constant's part in writing this work. I understand sort of the intervention in the debates about the Enlightenment and the tendency of the Enlightenment and kind of being a break on the Enlightenment and what. I was wondering if there's a, sort of political upshot of this as well, in the sense that, is Constant writing this as a justification of liberalism, I guess you could say, broadly understood. That is, if you have a liberal policy towards religion and religious toleration, look what good stuff can come out of it, right? In other words, that this is a lengthy treatise, sort of, in order to defend against both, in his time, forces of restoration and revolutionary forces that are both seeking, in some ways, to sort of foist religion on people, or anti-religion in the other sense. And I suppose Constant's point in this 900-page book is that look at what actual benefits you can get by just laying off. Is that right? I mean, what's your sense in terms of like his political message or his political motivation here?
I do think it has got to be connected to his politics and his liberal politics and his politics of equality and liberty, because he says so. And his view of religion certainly would move in the direction of religious toleration, because you don't know which religion is going to make the most progress. And you should allow this agonism even between religions or within religions, so that people, by believing contradictions and by disagreeing with each other, will work toward the truth. There's a little bit of proto John Stuart Mill on that the truth emerges from argument and disagreement. So I think the liberalism and his view of how religion should be developed are very closely related.
I think we're at time about here. Hello, Kyle, by the way, I just saw you there. So I'd like to thank Chris for joining us. We made him work for his dinner, quite literally.
It's over too early. I was ready to go for another hour.
So thank you very much. And I enjoyed the paper, learned a lot, and I learned a lot from the discussion. I hope that you benefited as well. So
I did very much, and it was very nice to see some old friends and meet some new people, and look forward to future interactions. And thank you for your attention and reading carefully the paper.